I never thought the woman I shared my bed with would one day share my handcuffs with the police. The night they dragged me out of my own house, flashing lights painting the walls red and blue, my wife stood there crying crocodile tears, pointing her finger at me like I was a monster. They said I stole, I lied, I ruined lives, but it wasn't me. She made sure every piece of evidence had my name on it. She wanted me gone. She wanted me buried under chains instead of dirt. But what she forgot was this: I know her better than anyone, and I know exactly how to bring her down. I always thought betrayal would feel like a single sharp knife in the back, quick, brutal, final. But the truth is, it doesn't always come like that. Sometimes it seeps in slowly like poison in the veins, disguised as tenderness, disguised as trust. That's how it was with my wife, the woman I built a life with, the one I promised to protect, the one I thought would stand by me until the end. She didn't need to kill me to destroy me. She just needed to twist the world so that everyone else believed I was already guilty. It started with small things, the kind you don't notice at first because you don't want to. A misplaced bill, a conversation she said we had that I couldn't remember, an odd look from one of my co-workers after a meeting. Little glitches in the fabric of my life. She always had an explanation, always delivered with that soft voice and those steady eyes. And I believed her, because love makes a fool out of a man faster than whiskey ever could. Looking back, I realized she had been planting seeds long before I caught on. She managed our finances, she handled most of the paperwork, and she had access to everything that bore my name. I thought it was partnership. She made me believe she was just taking weight off my shoulders, being the organized one. I never thought she was laying the foundation for my downfall. But she was. Every signed check, every emailed confirmation, every password I handed over was another brick in the cage she was quietly building around me. The night it all collapsed was colder than I remember for that time of year. I came home late from work, shoulders heavy, craving nothing but a hot shower and a few hours of sleep. The house was dark except for the porch light, and as I stepped inside, I noticed the air felt strange, tight, humming, charged with something I couldn't put my finger on. Then the flash of red and blue lights bled through the curtains. My stomach dropped before I even heard the knock. When I opened the door, there they were, 3 officers, their faces hard, their voices sharp. They said my name like it was already stained, already guilty. "You're under arrest." The words fell like stones. I stood there frozen, trying to catch up, trying to understand. My wife appeared behind them, robe wrapped tight around her, tears streaking down her face like a painting smeared in the rain. She wouldn't look at me directly, just clutched her arms and told them she was so sorry for what I had done. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but the cold bite of handcuffs silenced me. The neighbors had gathered by then, their shadows stretching under the glow of flashing lights. I caught a few faces I'd shared beers with, people I'd mowed lawns beside, people who used to wave when I drove past. Now they looked at me with narrowed eyes, with disappointment, with disgust. I was no longer their neighbor. I was a criminal in their eyes. They listed the charges as if reciting a grocery list: embezzlement, fraud, theft. Words that didn't belong to me, but clung to me anyway. I laughed at first, a short, broken sound, because the absurdity of it was too much. But the laughter died quick when I saw the paperwork. My name, my signature, my accounts. Everything traced back to me. It was airtight. Too airtight. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was designed. Someone had drawn the map of my destruction and walked me down the path step by step. And the someone was standing right there on the porch, pretending to cry into her sleeve. I shouted her name as they shoved me into the back of the car, but she didn't flinch. Didn't move. Just let the door close on me like I was a stranger she had no reason to save. The ride to the station was a blur of flashing lights and cold stares in the rearview mirror. My heart pounded, my mind racing through every interaction, every shared moment, every time I trusted her. By the time we pulled into the station, I knew. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had orchestrated this. She had built the perfect trap. And I had walked right into it, sitting in that cell, the walls pressing in close, the whispers of other inmates crawling under my skin. I felt the weight of everything crashing down. My reputation, my career, my marriage, my freedom. She had taken it all in one clean sweep. And yet, even in the pit of that hell, one thought burned brighter than the rest. She forgot who I am. She forgot what I'm capable of when I've got nothing left to lose. That night I swore under my breath. She might have framed me, but the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They booked me like I was already guilty. The mugshot camera clicked. The ink smeared across my fingertips. The number they slapped onto my chest. All of it felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake from. The fluorescent lights above hummed like an executioner sharpening his blade. I'd never stepped foot inside a police station before. Never been on the wrong side of the law, and yet here I was, reduced to nothing more than a case file in a drawer. The detectives sat me down in a room colder than the December wind. They leaned forward with their questions, eyes narrowing each time I swore I was innocent. "We've got records, statements, signatures," one of them said, slapping a folder down on the table. He opened it like he was revealing scripture. Page after page bore my name, my handwriting, my accounts. It was like staring into a mirror that had been warped by someone else's hand. And then, like a cruel encore, they slid photographs across the table. Pictures of my wife in tears pointing at documents, her words scribbled into the officer's notes. She said I'd been hiding money from her, stealing from my company, manipulating everyone around me. She painted me as a monster, a liar, a man living a double life. The note said she was brave for coming forward. Brave. My wife was playing the victim while I was being crucified. I stayed silent longer than I should have, because part of me couldn't believe it. Part of me still wanted to think it was all some mistake that could be explained away. But as the hours bled into each other, reality sank in deeper. She had built this. She had been planning it for months, maybe years. She wanted me erased, buried under paperwork and shame. When they finally let me call someone, I didn't know who to trust. Friends? Colleagues? My brother. Who would believe me when the evidence looked so clean, so damning? I dialed numbers with trembling hands, heard the hesitation in voices I'd once relied on. Some didn't answer. Some said they'd pray for me and hung up fast. My world had shrunk to the size of that cold room, and she had orchestrated every second of it. Court came fast, too fast. The prosecution had their story polished, their evidence stacked high. My lawyer, a public defender with more cases than hours in the day, whispered about plea deals, about saving face. But I couldn't swallow that. To admit guilt was to let her win completely. To sign my name on that confession would be like handing her my soul. No, I wasn't going to make it that easy for her. Still, I watched her in that courtroom. She sat there with her head bowed just enough to look broken, her hands clasped tight in her lap. When she glanced at the jury, her eyes glistened perfectly, tears welling on cue. She wasn't just lying. She was performing, and damn it, she was good. Every sniffle, every trembling word worked its way into their hearts. They looked at her like she was a woman who had endured something unspeakable. And me? I was the villain in their eyes. But here's the thing about lies. No matter how carefully they're spun, no matter how airtight they look, there's always a seam, always a thread left loose. And sitting there, my life burning down around me, I saw it. It was small, subtle, but it was there. On one of the documents they claimed I had signed, a transfer of funds, The date was wrong. I remembered it clear as day, because I was out of town on business that week. My phone's GPS, my hotel receipts, even the damn restaurant bill I signed that night. All of it could prove I wasn't anywhere near the bank. My lawyer dismissed it at first, said it wasn't enough, but I felt it deep in my bones. It was the crack in her armor. Hope is a dangerous thing in the hands of a desperate man. That night in my cell, as the lights dimmed and the noise of the others faded into the walls, I stared at the ceiling and whispered to myself. She thought she had beaten me. She thought she had written the ending of my story. But she forgot one thing. I'm not the kind of man who stays buried. I was going to tear apart her masterpiece of lies, brick by brick, until the truth stood naked in the light. And when I did, she'd wish she had finished me off completely. Prison has a way of teaching you patience, whether you want to learn it or not. The days stretched out like an endless desert, but inside that desert I carved out an oasis. Small moments to think, to plan, to sharpen the rage into something useful. Rage without direction is fire without fuel. Rage with purpose? That's a weapon. At first, all I had was that one detail, the wrong date on the transfer. It gnawed at me because it was proof she wasn't perfect. She was clever, meticulous, but not flawless. That mistake meant there could be others. And if I could find one, I could find them all. My cellmate, an older man named Harris, had been locked up half his life. He wasn't interested in my innocence. In here, everyone claimed they were innocent. But he respected my determination. He told me something I'll never forget. If she framed you this good, then she's arrogant. And arrogance always leaves fingerprints. So I started digging. My lawyer didn't have time, but I had nothing but time. I asked for case files, scoured every photocopy they'd let me see. I wrote down dates, signatures, cross-checked them against my memory. I thought about my travel, my work, the places I'd been. And slowly, a pattern started to form. She hadn't just forged documents. She'd built a timeline so tight it was almost too perfect. And that's where mistakes hide. In perfection. Meanwhile, she was out there tightening the noose. My brother stopped writing. Old friends turned cold. Word had spread that I was a thief, a fraud, a man who had betrayed everyone close to him. She was poisoning the well of my entire life, sip by sip. And the worst part? People believed her. They believed her because she wore grief like a queen's crown, because she knew how to tilt her head just so, how to lower her voice at the right moment. But Harris was right. Arrogance leaves fingerprints. And one day, buried in the stack of financial statements, I found another. A wire transfer to an account I had supposedly set up, except I recognized the bank. It was the same one her cousin worked at. I hadn't thought about him in years, but the connection was too sharp to ignore. That account wasn't mine. It was hers, hidden under a name she thought no one would trace back. The realization hit me like a fist to the chest. She hadn't just framed me. She was profiting off it. Every dollar stolen, every asset drained, it was funneled into her own web. She wasn't satisfied with destroying me. She wanted to rebuild herself on the ashes of my life. That night, I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling of my cell, my fists clenched tight. I could almost see her face in the dark smug, believing she'd buried me. But now I had more than hope. I had evidence. Thin, fragile, but real. I knew what I had to do. I had to get out. Not just physically, but legally. I had to claw my way back into a position where I could expose her without giving her a chance to twist it further. And that meant playing her game better than she ever imagined I could. The next morning, I told my lawyer about the cousin, the bank, the transfer. He brushed it off at first, said circumstantial connections wouldn't hold. But when I pressed, when I showed him how the dates lined up, how the signatures shifted just slightly from one page to the next, He finally looked at me differently. For the first time since my arrest, I saw doubt in his eyes. Not doubt about me, but about her. It wasn't enough to free me. Not yet. But it was a spark. And sparks have a way of growing into flames if you feed them right. As weeks turned into months, I kept feeding that fire. I studied every detail, built my case in the shadows, and waited. Because I knew the day would come when she slipped again, when arrogance would make her careless. And when it did, I'd be ready. And so, the plan began to take shape. Not just to clear my name, but to make sure she paid for every ounce of suffering she'd poured into my veins. She thought she'd framed me for life, but she forgot one thing. A cornered man doesn't stop fighting. He sharpens his teeth. They told me the law moves slowly. They weren't wrong. But slow is not the same as impotent. While the town whispered and watched, while my wife practiced her grief like a litany in the soft rooms of our house, I let the law do its work and I did mine. I learned how to be patient and how to strike when the timing was precise. The last part of this story was never going to be a reckoning of fists and fury. It would be administrative and terrible in its steadiness. Subpoenas, sworn statements, bank freezes, the kind of slow machinery that drains a life of comfort until the walls fall inward. The morning the subpoena arrived at her office, she looked as if a hand had reached through the paper and squeezed her heart. She ripped it open with a trembling thumb and then read the lines as if they'd been written in a language she'd once thought she understood, but now found foreign. Her lawyer called me a week later, voice brittle, asking for a meeting. He wanted to know what I intended to do. I told him I intended to let the truth be seen. He asked quietly whether I wanted him to arrange a mediated settlement to keep things from the newspapers. I told him no. There are things that cannot be mediated. There are things that must be confronted. When the auditors arrived, they were polite men and women with clipboards and the kind of patience that has been cultivated by bureaucracy. They asked pointed, careful questions, and they moved through ledgers like surgeons. I watched from a distance as they turned her perfect life into a paper trail of increasingly ugly entries. Her accounts, once glossy with the sheen of prosperity, began to show the ragged edges of illegality. Shell companies with names that sounded respectable. Transfers timed to the day she said she'd been at a charity event. Invoices from non-existent vendors. It was all there, the quiet architecture of theft. People asked me if I felt vindictive when I watched them lift the curtain. I don't think it's vindictiveness so much as the satisfaction of a balanced ledger. Justice in the slow bureaucratic sense has a certain finality to it. It refuses the melodrama of immediate vengeance, replacing it with the accumulation of consequences. I preferred that. A man who has been nearly erased needs the solidity of process to prove he was real. She fought at first, of course. Denials issued like practiced prayers. Errors, she called them. Misunderstandings. Her friends rallied a few perfunctory statements on her behalf. Her lover spat the same defenses with the bravado of someone trying to salvage the last of his dignity. But the documents were implacable. There's no drama in a spreadsheet, only an unblinking progression of numbers that, when connected, tell a story without adjectives. The auditors followed the money, and the money followed her. One evening, after a particularly dry meeting where a senior investigator had asked her about a batch of transfers that led to an account registered in a neighboring state, she broke in a way that no subpoena could have anticipated. She came home late, and under the dim kitchen light, she began to sob with a ferocity that made the house shake. I was there, but not to console. I watched from the hallway and saw the way the ceramic clutched in her hands quivered. She pressed it to her chest like someone holding shattered glass. The woman I once thought I knew sobbed as if she had been stripped of everything. I felt no triumph. There was a hollow ache that lived under satisfaction. It felt like the memory of a lost child, but the world kept moving. The bank, finally convinced by the lineage of invoices and the corroborations we'd managed to collect, froze accounts tied to the shell companies. Lenders began to question lines of credit that had been extended under false pretenses. One by one, institutional support she'd relied on withdrew. That's the quiet cruelty of consequence. It moves without spectacle, but it is thorough. Houses can be sold, reputations can be repaired, but the immediate network of favors and easy credit collapses first, like scaffolding removed from a building before it settles into ruin. Meanwhile, I had one more move left that was not financial. I had always been careful about spectacle. The public stage is where truth and lies fight under the lights, and you never know whose words will be believed. Yet there are moments when a face-to-face, when a voice that was silenced for too long finally speaks, matters more than any document. I wanted her to see the result up close, to feel the precise cold of consequence. I wanted her to understand fully the person she had tried to bury, so I arranged a meeting of a certain kind. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't demand she meet me in a dark alley. I requested a chance to speak at the charity event she was hosting under the guise of an unrelated topic. Her lawyers balked. She protested. But when they realized the charity needed publicity and the event required a board of trustees that included people I'd known for 20 years, they relented. They thought I'd use the speech to whine. They were wrong. The night of the event, the room was full of the town's polite faces, people who'd once sipped lemonade on my porch, retirees in their Sunday best, a scattering of local press. I walked to the podium with a quiet step and felt the weight of history sit across the room like an old coat. I spoke about the importance of trust and stewardship, about how communities survive on honest work. I didn't accuse her then. I spoke to the ideals she'd pretended to embody. But I also planted a seed of a different kind of truth, the value of names and records, and how those who care for civic institutions bear a responsibility to be transparent. Afterward, when the tea was cooling and speeches waned, I asked to speak privately with a few board members. I slid a copy of the ledger across the table to a woman who had been like an aunt to me for years. Her face, when she read the numbers and the names, changed from tired curiosity to a kind of stunned comprehension. She excused herself with a small, tight breath, and then, in a way that still humbles me, she came back and said simply, "We should have known." That admission spread through the committee like a scent, and it was the scent of betrayal catching up with itself. I did not need to shout her sins from rooftops. The combination of legal pressure, community erosion, and the slow suffocation of funds was doing the work. The man who had once sat in the wings, her lover, found calls unanswered, doors closed. He tried to gather friends to back him, but the social promise he'd used as heart lube was now thin. Pride does not pay bills, and when the checks stop, so does the bravado. There was a hearing in a windowless room where the bright light was clinical and the air tasted of old coffee and legal paper. She sat across from me and looked smaller than any of us expected. Her lawyer offered weak objections. When the investigator asked a simple question, who had authorized a specific transfer on a particular date, her mouth opened and closed like a fish. She had practiced denial for so long that straying into honesty felt like stepping off a cliff. In that moment, she was not performing. Not for cameras or neighbors, but for survival. She grasped at answers that crumbled in her hands. After the hearing, while we sat in a sterile corridor, she finally spoke to me alone. Her voice was raw. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said, too small for the scale of what she'd done. It was the same line I had heard years earlier. An echo from the past when we'd argued and apologized and trudged back to a fragile kind of peace. Now it lay out like an explanation that was embarrassingly inadequate for the damage it had caused. I could have shouted. I could have spat venom. Instead, I looked at her and felt something like pity for the person she'd allowed herself to become. "What you did," I said, slow and steady, "was not a mistake. It was a choice." She swallowed hard, and for a second I thought she might collapse. She did not. She had become someone who could survive by calculation. She had also become someone who could not see herself without illusions. That is a kind of prison I cannot free another person from. Legal consequences followed. Fines, restitution, the slow process of disentangling finances that had been braided deliberately to frustrate discovery. They can bury assets in 5-minute meetings. It takes months of subpoenas to find them again. But the law at last moved in a way that matched my persistence. She was charged in a civil case for misappropriation and in an administrative proceeding that cost her professional credibility. The criminal case that had engulfed me took on a new light as her implication grew. Prosecutors who had once been skeptical found new interest. The district attorney's office reopened lines of inquiry. The community, which had been so ready to condemn me, now recoiled slightly at the realization that no single narrative had been sufficient. The truth was messier, larger, and far more human. When the final settlements were read, legally tedious, emotionally devastating, she signed papers with a hand that refused to steady. They seized accounts, redirected funds to those who had been harmed, and forced the sale of assets to pay restitution. She lost the house in a quiet transaction that left the neighbors whispering. Her name, once a part of polite introductions, became the cautionary footnote in conversations about trust. The man she'd counted on faded from town like someone trying to disappear from a painting. What happens after such exposures is complicated. There is an awkwardness to living in the same town as someone who has betrayed you, but not in a way that satisfies catharsis. People don't always know how to look at you after you have been both victim and actor in a public drama. Some seek you out with casseroles and apologies. Others pretend nothing happened. I accepted both. I didn't need the validation. I needed peace. In the weeks after the legal dust settled, I remodeled the study. Not as a monument to victory, but as a piece of therapy. We removed the dark wood shelves where the forged ledgers had been sort of shelved metaphorically and physically. I painted the walls a pale, calm color. I planted bulbs in the yard that would bloom next spring. Small things, vital things. They were pieces of a life being reassembled. She left town quietly, not with the swagger of a woman reinventing herself, but with the furtive gait of someone carrying a suitcase heavy with consequence. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she found a place in another state, a small apartment, a job that paid less and asked for less. There are people who believe punishment must be loud to be real. I believe punishment that reconfigures the patterns of daily life is often far more consequential. Do I feel lighter? In some ways, yes. The huge, terrifying pressure of being accused and almost erased had been lifted. I could go outside without seeing suspicion flare in people's eyes. I could stand in a room and not feel like a case file. But the memory of being cuffed and taken away, of watching the woman I loved perform shock in front of a crowd, is not something you can unremember. It shapes the way you trust. It enforces a new prudence in relationships you can't shed. People ask me sometimes if I wanted revenge in the old-fashioned way, to watch her kneel in the dirt and beg. I tell them the truth. My revenge was survival and reclamation. It was making sure the ledger balanced. It was ensuring the man who had been accused had the chance to put pieces back together. I suppose that is less cinematic than a fist fight on a dark road, but it is far more enduring. I reclaimed my name, my business, my right to be a man who is judged by facts rather than theatrical tears. I still wake sometimes in the night with that metallic memory of handcuffs clicking. But those nights are fewer. Life, as it does, finds little ways to stitch a wound. I have friends who sit with me on the porch and talk about nothing important. I have a neighbor who drops off bread every Sunday. The town notices me in a way that is kinder now, more measured. People greet me with real smiles rather than curious glances. That is a victory, small as it may be. At the end of this, I learned a hard lesson about human nature. That people will perform complex rituals of righteousness for convenience, and that systems built for trust can be manipulated by those who learn the language of it better than the rest. But I also learned that perseverance, method, and a willingness to invite the light into dark places will undo even carefully staged lies. She framed me because she wanted a life without me. She forgot one thing. The man she tried to bury was stubborn in his right to breathe, and when he asked the world to look, the world did. So I live now in the careful middle ground between victory and loss. I go to the hardware store. I fix the fence. I write a little and throw the pages away. The garden grows slowly, stubborn and honest. And when I pass that neighbor who once nodded like he owned my secrets, I meet his eye, and we share the small human thing that matters. A nod that says simply, "You're still here."